Well, good evening, or good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, whatever time it is that you're watching the show. For us here today, it's a good afternoon. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. Because we've got a nice, tight, intimate group here, I think I can do something rather more personal. And I will not be using PowerPoint, because I'm going to tell you a number of stories to help you understand how I've arrived at the point that I've arrived at today and what its relevance is to maybe what you are curious about regarding the future of medicine. I got my master's degree and my PhD here at the University of Alberta. My master's degree was in the biochemistry of memory. My PhD was in the neurophysiology of attention. In both instances, it was deep science, heavy lab work, and an absolute passion to understand the relationship between the brain and behavior. That was my specialty. And that was driven by an extraordinary curiosity about how everything that we do, and what I'm doing just right now, could possibly work. I was as fascinated about it as maybe you might have been when you lay in the meadows one summer evening and looked at the sky and wondered what infinity was. I was just as confused with how the brain has the capability of doing what it does. That was probably my introduction to the world of healthcare, the world of science, the world of medicine. A second aspect of my career which led me here today came when I realized I really wasn't an academic. That, as some of you may know, you don't have to be terribly bright to get a PhD. You have to be compulsive and obsessive and intensely curious, which I was, and I was good at project work. When I turned down my postdocs at Yale, UCLA, and University of Illinois, and instead decided that it was management that was my forte, my strength, and my subsequent career, I entered into an unusual place where one would think with a PhD in brain research, going into government seems like an oxymoron. Fortunately, at the time, I was engaged in an area of the government that at that time had a high priority, and it was to address the issues in society that medicine was facing in services to people with mental retardation. Mental retardation, by the way, is treated in the pediatrics guide as is Down syndrome in a very superficial way. One page telling you something about what the potential is for an individual to reach a grade 3 level of education, which seemed rather superficial. When I entered into government, I had made a transition from university through an institute for the study of mental retardation, which talked about mental retardation not from a medical perspective, but from a developmental perspective. And I share that with you because that transition over the following 12 years was, to some extent, not just transformative, but revolutionary. What transpired during that time was an offloading of the problems of mental retardation from the medical profession that was able to do a physical diagnosis and hand it off as a developmental issue, which was no longer residing within the field of medicine, but was residing more within the field of parents, community, school system, educators. We're individuals who have potential for learning, which every living human being does, and the challenges of what to do with the developmental capabilities of an individual, even though they may have limited potential. I share that with you not because today you would assume mental retardation is necessarily involved in your curriculum, but to point out how quickly a transition can occur in society when you look at a problem in a different way. I was thinking this morning when I was preparing for today whether or not I wanted to look at this problem in my classical manner, which is the journey from my own career through from a passive interest in science to a deep interest in science to some of the transitions from one field of study to another. And as I was looking in the mirror, brushing my teeth this morning, something hit me. And I'm going to ask you a question, although I'll answer it because it's such a big room, I don't want all of that noise. What was the real strength that Wayne Gretzky had to become really top grade in his field? Was it his capacity to pay attention in a very linear manner and really zero in with focus as maybe a golfer does? Or was it something else? And what we hear about with Gretzky is he had lateral perspective. He had the capability to see in a wider range than anyone else on the ice. That he talks about knowing where the puck is going. Well, he knew where the puck was going because he could actually see where it was being launched from and get some sense of that field in front of him because he had such a wide range of perspective. I share that with you because I think the transitions that most of us who are in the innovative field have is the capability to see laterally. Not to see in depth at great detail, which is what I certainly did in my PhD, was to go right down to the level of the cell and try and understand behavior, which is probably more of an emergent property like water is out of hydrogen and oxygen. Consciousness and perception and learning and memory may well be emergent properties that you can't possibly discover through a micro-analysis of the structure of polypeptides, which I was moving from one untrained animal to a trained animal to identify where memory was in fact coded. Or the work going on at the cellular level in terms of monitoring the action potentials of clusters of cells from animals that were paying attention to certain stimuli versus others to try and track where the attentional switching mechanism in the brain was. I don't think that the degree of focus to that detail is really where discovery is found. It's with those individuals that can see relationships that are probably tangential, but may not be seen as significant at the moment. For those that can abandon their current way of thinking, and as Steve Jobs says, think different. Sometimes it isn't that linear analysis that leads us into insight and discovery, but the craziest associations that you could imagine, sometimes only to be heard in a bar. And I share that with you because in the course of my career, my transitions were very lateral. I don't think neither I, nor parents, nor people who knew me as I was growing up would have imagined that I would make a transition from an academic environment into government. And that government, in the course of my career with it, and I was in social services and community health with a responsibility for everything from child welfare to mental health to public health to social allowance. And that within government, the assignments that I would get, and were initially for about 12 years, on helping transform the way in which we look at problems of mental retardation, to look at what the options are in terms of a more developmental model, which was literally decanting institution using market forces to give parents choices, which is, interestingly enough, when we ask them why they're on a waiting list for an institutional bed that they clearly resented. And when we asked them if they needed a bed today, tomorrow, or yesterday, they said tomorrow. And we asked them, why are you on the waiting list today? Because we were told there was a shortage. If you had an option, would you pick that bed? No, I wouldn't. What would you do? I would raise my child at home. There were people in the medical profession that were referring this problem as good meat, bad meat. And that they would sort out the good meat from the bad meat, and the bad meat would go to the institution, the good meat would be kept in community. I know that sounds crass. But it sometimes happens when you're dealing with an irresolvable problem from a medical perspective. But from a developmental perspective, the model changed dramatically because every individual had learning potential. Regardless of whether or not the individual was PhD material or whether the individual was a domestic, or whether the individual may only in the course of his lifetime learn how to make a signal that he was hungry. The model was phenomenally different, and the potential and the way the individual was viewed was dramatically different. It was no longer a physical or physiological issue. It was a developmental, and that is the capability of that thing to perform action, skills of daily living, etc. So there's an example of a transition within a discipline that was rather dramatic, not because necessarily of science, but because of a societal response to a demand. To a populace that was saying enough is enough. The model that we have was fitting for 100 years ago when we had nothing, to a model today that is highly variable because communities have the capacity to be so much more accommodating. And when we bring these disciplines of sociology and medicine together, sometimes we find we look at the problem in a dramatically different way. During the course of my career within the Department of Social Services and Community Health as an assistant deputy minister, I was tagged by some as Christopher Robin. It's an interesting management model where you do trust everyone and you believe that we will all be driven and passioned by a mission, and that the interpersonal issues will become secondary. Well, there are very few organizations where interdisciplinary issues aren't primary, and that's what the management ends up spending most of his time on, is sorting out administrative matters without regard to the mission. which may well in medicine, for example, to make a society healthier or to make an individual or help an individual become healthier. I was not only deemed Christopher Robin because of my management model, which was to, as Mahatma Gandhi put it, there they go, I must hasten after them, for I am their leader. My model was to understand where it is that we're going and to get out and convey that and appreciate the fact that people individually, collectively would take us there without needing necessarily a work plan or a handbook. And indeed, in that field that I have referred to, that's exactly what did happen. Parents aligned, communities aligned, young staff that were enthusiastic aligned, and old disciplines fell by the wayside, and a new manner of service emerged. Today, that institution is gone. It wasn't decanted by moving beds from community to, or from institution to community. It was decanted because people made choices. It wasn't political engineering by a party that said this is wrong and that is right. It was with some degree of patience to help parents understand that there are alternatives, and if those parents were prepared to accept those new alternatives, then the systems would change instead of vice versa. We didn't impose deinstitutionalization. We let the consumer or the user or the advocate make that decision one by one. And if anybody wanted to go back and reverse the tide, that individual was allowed to do so, so there was no imposition. And part of that is a byproduct of one moment in my career at that time where I was out at Dogwood Crescent in Sherwood Park. And the occasion was rather different from what we often faced. It was a moment in time where a community was responding negatively about the location of a group home in that community. And I was being asked, because of my zealot manner and my silver tongue and my enthusiasm for the issue, to preside over a discussion in a gymnasium between a community and a small group of parents that wanted to bring their children into that community, and the community was reacting against it. And so I was between a rock and a hard place. And I remember a woman with tears in her eyes saying, "It's not that I don't appreciate these children, I just don't want to look out my picture window each day and see them because I will feel awful." And I thought that's rather superficial, but on the other hand, that was a real human being expressing the reluctance to be part of the, quote, solution. And so I was asked what my advice was, and I said, as a parent, I would never move into a community where my children were not respected or accepted. So why would I recommend that you locate a home here within an environment in which that home will not function well? I said, we'll find another place, and that's exactly what did take place. But a fellow named Jim Henderson, and he probably has no idea that I remember this, stood up and he said, Dr. Kinkaide, or Perry Kinkaide, as I hopefully was known, we appreciate your enthusiasm and for you being with us tonight. But you remember this till your dying day. If you make a mistake, it's on our shoulders. It was very sobering, because my role with being the spokesman and to some extent being a tacit leader was to help people understand a new way of thinking and a new dynamic. But at the same time, I was being cautioned by those that would suffer the consequences of moving too fast or moving in the wrong direction, that it wasn't going to be on my shoulders, it was going to be on his and his wife and his family. That was very sobering, because there are moments in time when you're a change agent where you get full of yourself and you get heady because you think you've seen the future, and you start rushing the market, and before you know it, you've outrun the market, you've lost your credibility, you've stumbled, and someone has fallen. And if you're really committed to change, then you'll always remember that it's the individual that we're changing, not the system. We're trying to change the system to meet the needs of an individual. And I'm going to come back to that when we get to data, because the essence of my discussion with you today is the power and the persuasiveness of understanding what a patient is and what a person is when they get caught in a system that is archaic or a system that is changing, and how that individual, in our desire to change the system, we sometimes forget the individual, or as the system matures, suppliers end up dominating the system, not individuals. It creates a void. It creates tension. And there's a point in time when the tension becomes so great that either a revolution occurs, or a leader emerges, or a new technology finds its way in that space and aids that transition, or causes a revolution with huge disruptive implications. As a change agent with the government, I moved from working in the field of mental retardation to regionalization to areas in mental health, which were probably the most complex and remain so, into some work on privatization. When I moved into the area of funding reform and privatization for government, it was clear that what I had been doing was very unpopular among those that worked in the bureaucracy, but was not unpopular within the public. To be a change agent is never popular when you're in your immediate environment. It's often trying to make a transition from here today to tomorrow. And you're usually empowered by those that have power, but you are despised by those that are in power at the moment or are suppliers at the moment, because you're disrupting trading patterns. That journey came to an end not as a byproduct of doing anything wrong as it related to privatization, because I didn't opt for it as an ideology. To me, privatization was simply a matter of individuals making choice. It was a matter of introducing market forces into an environment in order for individuals to make a choice on what they wanted, not what the system imposed or what the suppliers provided. And that privatization was simply the empowerment of individuals to make choice. So it wasn't an ideology, it was a management option. That when the forces of competition would regulate supply and demand and standards, then it probably was acceptable to privatize a service because competitive forces would discipline it. But to move from a public monopoly to a private monopoly was wrong. And that would be an ideological commitment. At that time, someone approached me and said, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" And that was the beginning of my next career. And I thought it was an insult, but it was in fact a job offer. And I was offered to get into consulting outside of government, which I embraced, and I was scared. I was really scared. Even though I was 50 and my mortgage had been paid off, it was quite a transition from an environment where I'd never had to sell anything, just convince a minister and cabinet, to an environment where on a day-to-day or regular basis I was being challenged to find something that was relevant to the market that people were prepared to dip into their pocketbooks with for their hard-earned money. But I learned, and the challenges were significant, and I was just scared enough to learn fast. And lo and behold, within a reasonable period of time, I guess it was 1 week, the 3 significant lessons of that week bore fruit, and within 3 years I was managing partner of KPMG Consulting here in Edmonton and responsible for the national practice of knowledge management, which gave me some insights which later on in my career really were rich, but at the time were ahead of the market. Knowledge management was being practiced as a technological phenomenon in North America by companies that were selling computing power and computers and software applications. It was being sold in Europe as a human resource, as a human management issue. My area of practice in the management consulting ranged from everything from forest fire practices in the Northwest Territories to grading systems in the hotel industry in Canada and Taiwan to the dental faculty here in Alberta. It was at that time that the President, Paul Davenport, wanted to close down the dental faculty, and I was engaged to sue the university by the Alberta Dental Association, which I said I don't do, but maybe we can find a better way. And the better way was to put the mouth back in the body, charge a tuition fee that was compatible with what the value of the degree was, engage the alumni in supportive alumni, and enter into fields of research that were more applied and relevant. And so my career in management consulting was exciting and challenging. And then it was time to respond, or I guess the words respond, to the call of the geriatric G-force of golf, gardening, and grandchildren, which some call retirement, and I called boring. It lasted a few hours, and then some young lady asked me if I would help her develop her early-stage startup company. And I thought, retirees don't work, they hand work to others, and they put their hard-earned money on the line because they gamble that they can help this company evolve. And I made a mistake, not in the fact that I put money on the deal, but I matched an Irish redhead with a German blonde. And lo and behold, I spent the next few months resolving conflict between two people who had very different perspectives on what it was to run a business. And I share that with you because I made a lot of mistakes as I entered into the world of what is called by some angel financing, or early stage financing, or the piloting companies through the valley of death, or commercialization of innovations, whatever you want to call it. It was taking something that had no value and bringing it to a point where it would have value, which is today in my book encapsulated by simply referring to the phrase, knowledge without relationships has no value. And so in angel financing, you find someone who knows something but has no relationships with bankers or with market or with staff, and your job isn't simply to put capital on the table. That would be a naive recipe, but to help them build networks and relationships that will allow that knowledge to evolve to the point that indeed it does have sustained value and a company is born. But knowledge in itself is nothing. And that's why it's so frustrating sometimes for someone to show me an idea and want to wrap IP around it and declare its value before it's ever been assessed within a market environment. And so in retirement, I made a lot of mistakes. It took about 5 years to get out of the sweaty pajamas phase because my estate and my reputation and my relationships were in jeopardy because of some of the people that I ended up doing business with, because I was reading too many business plans and not spending enough time understanding people and who I might be doing business with during those tense days when you're in the valley of death and things are not going the way expected and people start tearing at one another or destroying teams instead of pulling together. About 5 years into it, I built a small business advisory of 5 people to get me out of trouble or keep me out of trouble. And that group today is 11,000. So that journey from 5 to 11,000 is a story in itself, but I won't spend a lot of time on it. Simply to say, what became apparent is that ideas were lying fallow and were dying in the lab, the garage, on the desktop, or at the banker's desk. And what was needed was a network that those ideas could flourish because they could find their way to money and marketing and management and manpower and moxie and mergers and marriages and manufacturing. All those cute little M's that I used to portray the recipe of taking an idea to fruition. They didn't exist, and they didn't exist for me either. And so as I was helping those with ideas, I try to commercialize those ideas, it was in fallow territory. It's changed dramatically as a byproduct of many things in recent years. That organization of 11,000 differentiates itself from simply being a society without direction to one that proclaims that its mission is to help diversify Alberta's economy through technology. But the interesting thing about it is it really isn't an organization about technology at all. Oh yes, we'll spend a year on diversifying or demystifying people's understanding of what the digital rural broadband is, or what fusion energy is, or what cell therapy is as an advance into personalized medicine, or analytics and its implications. And you might think because they spend a year in public with symposiums and conferences and policy documents and lobbying around those technologies that were about technology, but in fact that's not really at all. The technology is a hook to build relationships and to build depth of understanding, just like it was in the field of mental retardation. Our mission wasn't mental retardation, it was individuals and helping society understand the individual, not the pieces. Not the problem, but the potential. And so when we work with a technology, we're trying to often help people understand the market, the problem, what applications this technology can be applied to. Well, about a year ago, we spent on machine learning, offloading intelligence when machines decide. Offloading intelligence when machines decide was a venture into the area of artificial intelligence and robotics and singularity, etc. Our concern was that it was going to be viewed as a lot of discussion about robotics. And in reality, it was more about offloading of intelligence, an acknowledgement that machines are being programmed today to learn, meaning if they make a mistake, they adjust to that mistake. That there's a feedback loop that's written into the algorithm, that if the result that was anticipated when that algorithm was written is not realized, that algorithm will adjust or self-adjust. Some might call that intelligence. We simply wanted to reflect on the fact that this is not simply a reflex. There is an adjustment going on, and if the reflex doesn't work because the situation of the environment has changed, that reflex will adapt and change as well. Very relevant to the field of medicine, all of this, because medicine, I believe, and I think those who I work with believe, is probably the most vulnerable profession of all to some of the transitions going on in the field of algorithms and in the field of data analytics. You see, what's significant about the field of medicine and the field of healthcare in general is the extreme value to which society places on the promise of everlasting life or the promise of a painless life. Even though the ethic is thou shalt do no harm, and that the promise of everlasting life is secondary and not really what the profession proclaims, but what the patient or the client assumes. And that dichotomy, nobody bothers to address because it would be disruptive to an understanding that's implicit within the market, is we're helping extend your life, we're helping you make your life safer, whereas in reality the promise is thou shalt do no harm. And that was a very reasonable position when there was concern of people practicing medicine without proper credentials or without a proper base of knowledge. What's going on today, and I'll give you an illustration of an individual who some months ago, heart rate dropped to 28 from a normal rate of 48, which is low. That individual went to a Mediclinic. The Mediclinic panicked, was sent him to the hospital, emergency in an ambulance. That individual went home instead, got his BlackBerry and went to the hospital and lay on a gurney for a few hours under observation, where the conclusion after the assessment was, given that his father had a pacemaker and given that he was 70 years old and wasn't on any medication, that all of the indications were a pacemaker was indicated. That evening, under the sheet, the individual pulled out the BlackBerry and did an analysis of the medication that they were referring to and the symptoms, and drew his own conclusion and discussed with the nurse whether or not it was a listening doctor. And in the morning, there was a conclusion that it wasn't a pacemaker that was indicated. It was dehydration, even though it was counterindicated because he had a lower heart rate rather than a higher one. But that individual doesn't have a pacemaker anymore. But the point being, the individual was armed with an education, was armed with the manner of a dialogue with the professional, was armed with his BlackBerry. And that individual is disruptive to an environment that has been dominated by a professional-client relationship where the client, being one step above a slave in Roman times, is no longer prepared to be a client. He's no longer prepared to be a slave to those that have knowledge because he has knowledge as well. And so clients with knowledge are no longer clients. They gradually evolve into becoming consumers. They make choices. They enter into a dialogue. They seek something that they never dared seek before, which is called a relationship. And so in the field of medicine, and the field of education, and the field of law, and many of the fields dominated by professions, which earned that in law to the point of having exclusive rights of practice, and of promising thou shalt do no harm, that the professions today are being challenged by an environment in which knowledge is free-flowing. MIT doesn't any longer sell their curriculum. They give that for free. What they sell is their reputation and their relationships. And so in this field, in the field of medicine, as knowledge is becoming, quote, a commodity, which is free-flowing at the speed of light and literally connects all, wherever they may well be, that can have access, it isn't knowledge that we're necessarily selling in the future. It's trust based on relationships. That is a huge transition, particularly for a profession that for so long was viewed as having something exclusive, like gold, but it's not gold anymore. And that's where data and analytics comes in. The story of the conference is to some extent provocative. I think it's insightful. I think it does give foresight. I think it does do some assessments of where we may well be in future. But rather than doing that, its real strength is it's showing what we're already doing today. And it's showing it in forestry, in education, in transportation, in healthcare, in governance, in sports. There are huge data sets that have been assembled over the years and large knowledge pools that algorithms with objectivity are doing analysis of it and coming out with how to reduce your costs and how to reduce your risks and how to make decisions at the consumer level, to the point that someday people can imagine putting blood on a piece of glass or peeing on a piece of glass and taking it to the pharmacist and disintermediating that knowledge transfer between the professional and those that are handing him with his regime for treatment. So diagnostics, treatment, any area where knowledge has in fact been prevailed as what was missing in that relationship is disrupting the relationship because the knowledge is becoming free-flowing and being captured in some instances by machines or by algorithms that sit on a BlackBerry or sit on a tablet or sit embedded in a piece of glass. That transition from a knowledge base to a more relational, I say more relational because I'm not proclaiming that things will disappear, but I think the trends are well established that medicine, like many of the professions, is needing to strengthen its relational capabilities. And to test that, I asked a few months ago the various colleges and universities in Canada that train people in the medical professions whether they were changing in any way the admission criteria. And there is, out of McMaster, a screening device that's been developed, or screening tools or screening criteria that take into consideration not necessarily how bright the candidate is, but whether he's got relational skills. And I think that's indeed an indication that it isn't just how bright you are any longer that will make the difference. It's whether you have the capability to communicate, both to listen and to convey, and certainly to continuously learn. And I say that with an element of hesitation, because I'm sure we've all seen the individual who gets the certificate and puts it on his door and says, I never have to learn again because I've already got my degree. And that's probably the biggest insult to any profession, because the degree is there because you've proven the capability of learning and of being curious and of wanting to know. And I think it's a shame that the medical profession handed off to the pharmaceutical companies and to the treatment systems their own research capability, because it was once the doctors that were the supreme research. It was the doctor who accumulated knowledge, and through that knowledge arrived at decisions or hypotheses, and was a major instrument. But I think we've abandoned that, and I think it'll get rediscovered, and some of those who I've worked with in personalized medicine and cell therapy feel that's exactly where the profession really needs to go, is to get the doctor back into the game of being to some extent, a scientist. So that's much of what I wanted to talk to you about. To take you deeper into analytics is simply to take you into the fact that it's all over the world. Analytics is not the computing sciences department of the University of Alberta. It is not certainly owned by IBM or Microsoft or Google or Amazon. They're all parties to a transition from an ICT or technology-dominated environment of the last 50 to 70 years to an environment where that infrastructure is now being transformed or is morphing from a technology into a service. That what we envision libraries being in the future is not repositories of knowledge, but places that you go to find the algorithm in order to answer the question. And that the questions are resolvable by penetrating huge data sets that exist any place in the world in the cloud, doesn't matter where they are. And that those algorithms are doing the searches to find out what the answers. There are those in the world of construction that are telling me that in future they won't be issuing RFPs for companies to send in their costs and their specs, but they'll be RFPing for solutions. And that what they'll expect is the blueprints, the layout, the monitoring mechanisms for that building. They'll literally get a full meal deal in that bid. And the reason why is because the data exists today on what is energy efficiency, what is smart grid, how to build a facility that has longevity to it, how to build a school and recognize the transitions in the neighborhood that will someday allow that facility or ensure that that facility becomes a facility to serve an aging population in that neighborhood. A society where the automobile, which simply is gathering data through its sensors, is making decisions on how to get from point A to B, as airplanes do today. I mean, the pilot in the cockpit today is what the engineer in the caboose was yesterday. He's there in the event of an emergency. Otherwise, the plane literally flies itself as a drone. I think you're going to see the same thing over and over and over again. So I'll share with you a little exercise that I did over Christmas. And when I share this with you, some people think, what a weirdo. This is what he does over Christmas? I had a glass in front of me, and I was working with my BlackBerry, communicating about the conference and doing the things you can do with a BlackBerry at the speed of light, literally across continents. And with some of the things that I do, I literally do them as an industry of one. My BlackBerry's got 10,000 addresses in it. The database of the Alberta Council of Technology's got 11,000, and it's interconnected all over the province across 20 different industries. And so I can send out a note. It could be a question. Does anybody know where this type of an employee is? Or it could be a message of something having been discovered at Livermore National Laboratory in Fusion. And so in a way, I'm simply a conduit in a very large community. And as a consequence, a lot of things pass through my day. And as I was sitting there going through this fun in the morning rather than looking at the Edmonton Journal, something hit me, that it's not hard to imagine being connected to everyone on Earth. And this isn't arrogant speaking, simply the power of what the BlackBerry does today or what internet has become is to be literally globally connected is not outside of the realm of possible. But to be connected to everything is one thing, but to be all-knowing is another. And I don't mean as a smart-ass, but being able to have access to information, to have access to data. So it's not hard to imagine that the day will come where the information available, whether it be off the BlackBerry or off something we haven't yet seen, does access everything in the Library of Congress and everything that has ever been found that they referred to in that little video we saw earlier. That all the knowledge that's ever been assembled has been decanted out of books and placed in a database. So here's this little device sitting in front of me that I imagine that is connected to everyone alive today, with all the data you could ever imagine, historical and otherwise. And I thought, what would you ask this thing? I mean, I know what I might have asked it as a college boy, but we won't go there. I asked it, what should I do tomorrow? A simple question, because I didn't want it to fry. I wanted to ask it something quite simple. What should I do tomorrow? And I thought it's probably going to go into a do loop because it doesn't have information about tomorrow. It only has historical information. It took a while for it to answer. But when it did answer, it surprised me because the answer was, whatever it is that you do tomorrow, trust mankind, because to date, you've been doing a pretty good job. Meaning, when he looked at where errors have occurred in the course of history or personally, usually the adjustments that took place were positive adjustments. We do learn, we do adapt, and we do improve. And so I thought that's probably a pretty wise answer to look at history and realize that mankind overall has done a pretty good job in evolving from where we were in a cave to where we are today. I thought that was the end of my exercise. Hey, wait a minute, it said, hold on. Oh, it's got more to say. This part gives me goosebumps because when it spoke to me next, I wasn't ready for this one. It said, trust in God. I'm not a really religious person. Where did this come from? And he said, all of the decisions that mankind has made that has allowed us to prosper have come as a byproduct of the values that mankind has followed of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, respect thy neighbor, etc. He said, those are the values that got you here, and don't forget them. It wasn't this technology. It's not me as a machine. This machine is a byproduct of the values. And so the closing of the story was that it really isn't about technology at all. It's this balance between technology and our values, just as it is between our knowledge and our values. That we may learn how the body functions and how the brain functions, but that knowledge without an appreciation of the values that drive a society is nothing. Because knowledge outside of relationships is nothing, but knowledge inside relationships is more than the technology itself. There's a synergy. There's an emergent something that comes out of knowledge in the context of what we value, whether it be in a marriage, in a family, in a community, in a society, in a profession. And I wish we'd spend more time teaching and reflecting on technology and its implications. So when we talk about fusion energy, which is probably going to be realized within the next 18 months at Livermore National Laboratory with the inertial fusion and what's being done there, which will give us an 18 billion year supply of energy based on deuterium and tritium. What will that mean? Or what we're doing with cell therapy. And for those that you understand that as a form of personalized medicine that you have inside your body, the very stem cells that formed you in the first place and that when mobilized can do amazing things in terms of fixing or growing parts of your body. And what that might mean in terms of life extension. What does that mean to a society? Or what nanotech is going to promise, or what we're doing with the connectivity of all on Earth. All of these technologies, it isn't that any one is on the bench top. They all are. And they're all coming at us at once. We've never, since the Middle Ages, or maybe never ever, faced a period of time that is emerging. If we don't have our values sorted out, and that our institutional structures that have been built over the last 500 years, if we don't have that governance sorted out we will become victims of those technologies because they won't be shaped and driven by values that we respect. They'll be driven by whatever and whoever gets hold of those technologies first. So we have a responsibility as a legacy to ensure that the discoveries are in fact safe and developmental as it relates to our values. And I hope engineers understand that, and I hope doctors understand that, and I hope teachers understand that, and I hope those practicing law understand it, and understand that it is an ethic above the profession itself, that we all in the knowledge business have a responsibility to society as a whole. I don't think the governing mechanisms exist today, and I don't think they look anything like what we have today, which are very hierarchical, very authoritarian, and very little market reflection. Democracy is the best we've got. It's clumsy, it's arbitrary, and it moves at a very slow rate where technology moves very fast. And it's in that dilemma. When I was director of privatization, I said to the government, you don't have to declare privatization of the health system. The patient come consumer is going to take you there. You'll manage the waiting lists. You'll manage the rate of change through law and through taxing power. You will not regulate the direction. The consumer will regulate that direction because they are impatient. They're going to be carrying BlackBerries. They're going to be your Libyans of the future. You've got to listen real hard and listen a lot because they're fickle and they change quickly. But so does the technology. There's one other aspect of this that I think is important to reflect on, and I knew I was going to get to this point, and I knew I was going to forget it. So let me hesitate for a moment and see if I can remember what that next point is that I wanted to make. But it relates to the governance and the rate of change and the connectivity on a society at large. Much of what we've done in the last 2,000 years stems from Roman times, where the concept of public emerged, as many of you know. And we built programs for, quote, the public. And we profiled categories that programs would be designed to fit those who are in those categories are the public. And they were soft on the edges, but by and large, the public program was to try and serve the most. Didn't always serve all, but to serve the most. With what is occurring now with analytics and with data, there is no reason why the individual can't be served versus the public. Walmart today probably knows your spouse better than you do in terms of buying patterns. Amazon may know you better than you know yourself in terms of what you're interested in next. If that's the case, then we're in an environment where what the individual wants, the individual is going to expect. You can't any longer say to them, well, you fit this category, this is your program, and he'll say, BS, I am me. And if I don't get it here, I'm going to go elsewhere. I want to see you design the programs. In fact, maybe drop the concept of program altogether and customize my pension, and customize our relationship with the bank, and customize our relationship with the healthcare system. I am now a consumer, and I make choices. And I may be even a paying consumer versus distributing of a voucher. I think in the world that we're going into with algorithms and with the availability of Anatimes data, that the individual is really going to be a major force. And the concept of public may disappear. That may be an anachronism of the last 2,000 years. We've lived with it so long, it's hard to imagine that the concept of public may disappear. But we have lived with it for so long, and yet we're entering a period where under no circumstances should anybody dismiss an individual by simply saying, I don't know you. Well, then you ought to get to know me, because there's a lot of knowledge about who I am. And it's out there in systems that are not even using it today. But as they do, that individual will become increasingly empowered to realize, you know me, and therefore I want you to serve me in my way. We want that individual to be an informed consumer, not a stupid, arrogant, impatient consumer. So we've got a lot to do in terms of building those relationships and sustaining trust at a period when it isn't knowledge anymore. It's that relational dialogue about what I know and what you know and what we can do together. So that's my background. That's a little bit of what I wanted to talk about. It took you from the past to the future. It took you through the revolution that I think is forthcoming and well underway. This conference has got 3 dimensions to it. One of them is the first day is global. It's trying to portray that what we are going to talk about at that conference is of global relevance. So I've got a speaker from the United States, a speaker from India, and a speaker from Israel. And each one of them bring a unique perspective into the room about what they are going through, which is not a lot different than what we're going through. that this is a global phenomenon. The second day is about connecting and about community, where we portray 16 industries, 30 panels, 90 presentations. And what that is all about is what is already going on within an array of institutions here in Alberta. We're not importing those presenters. They are here in Alberta, transforming what's going on in 16 different industries. And I'm sure we could pick any one of them and find some that are going through this transition from technology to services as they begin to analyze the data that they have vis-a-vis what the customer wants. The third day is discovery. And this was fascinating. It was one of those moments where you're sitting in a chair and you're looking at what you've built and you're wondering, what do we really have here? And when I looked at the third day, after the first two, I thought the third day is a day of discovery. And usually when you think about discovery, you think about something out there, as opposed to internal insight or internal discovery. And I thought that what we're going to discover in that third day is the analytics industry exists, and exists here in Alberta already. We just never brought all these disparate pieces into the room at the same time. And so that third day is, what do we have here today? We have in the room the beginning and the formation and the foundation of a new industry, which none of them working in isolation would have ever seen. But when they see the mass and they see the communality of analytics to what they're all practicing, I think we have the foundation of an emerging industry in a province that should be nimble. It could be an early adopter, and it could make a huge difference with the level of talent and the knowledge that exists in the province, but we haven't seen it before. We've always assumed that our longevity and our prosperity would be built on the availability of free carbon. Wheat, meat, fiber, timber, oil and gas, in demand by downstream buyers. And that's what we need to do the next 100 years, is just keep on filling our pipelines and our trucks and our cargo holds and our trains, and we'll prosper. Well, if carbon ever becomes of less value because fusion emerges, for example, we got a problem because we don't have a diversified economy. So I think there's a lot we can do with the knowledge we have, but we need to look at the whole environment. I thank you very much. So can I take questions? Oh, I think you can do better than that. Okay, so, got a question for me, sir?
When you get right down to it, what are the mainstream challenges now? It seems that a lot of them are things that we just take for granted. Like take the intersection, the next one when you're driving, where there's a stop sign or a stoplight and you stop. And there are no other cars. Why do you stop? Well, it's the law. It's the way things work. When you look now at the self-driving car, I think a lot of people, they don't think much about the self-driving car. It doesn't mean much to them. It's not a part of their life. But what happens with those cars at intersections is most times they don't stop. They don't have to stop. They know where all the other cars are. There's a kind of flow, and you realize once we're in the era of the self-driving car, this time we accept of just waiting at a stoplight when there's no other cars around, because that's the law, we won't be doing that. What about, you're talking about being in contact with the world. Many of us are kind of feeling like that, but it's a kind of redundant contact because things aren't quite worked out. If you have multiple devices, you have desktop machines and laptops and then handheld phones that are smart, that do all the same things. If somebody sends you a message on Skype, a text message, it will pick one of those many devices, and it'll be right on top and obvious of that particular device, that particular message, but it won't be on the other ones. And so it's assuming that that one device is the only one that you have, but you may have many. You may spend days without going back to that one where this message is right on top. And so there are a lot of assumptions here that haven't been worked out. How many devices does a person have? When you send a message to the front, when you have it make a sound, Are they going to be there? Is that device with them? There are a whole bunch of things. And the thing that brought this to home this week is in my job of signing out kidney biopsies. It's important to dictate the report and to get it on the system. So I did all that, and in a timely manner. And so on Tuesday morning, I had this case done. It was on the system, everything was right. But on my desk is a phone with a red light that goes on when there's a voicemail there. And the one thing, I was checking my mail, I was checking everything, but I didn't look at the phone. So somebody sent me a message asking about that case, and they didn't look on the system to see that it was already signed out. So 2 days go by where this person is frustrated that I haven't answered the question that I answered in text Tuesday morning, but on Thursday they're frustrated that I haven't answered their voicemail. Well, it's because there are so marvelous many ways to communicate. How hard would it be to bring them all together? Well, I don't know how to do that, but that's obviously the future. So the future is never waiting at a traffic intersection when there's nothing coming, there's not another car in for miles. You won't have to do that anymore. And if somebody's sending you a message, it won't matter exactly how they send it. You will receive it. It seems simple, you know.
Well, I mean, you're touching on something in a physiological sense, is attention mechanisms. I mean,
yes.
in the human body, if you are not being exposed to change, that sensory mechanism will atrophy.
Yes.
If you put a young child into a closet, they will not develop, and all of the sensory mechanisms, et cetera, atrophy. When you are exposed to a lot of stimulation, your brain today sorts out what's signal and what isn't. So
yes.
there's noise in this room that you may not be paying attention to, but it's entering into the brain, and
yep.
something in that brain is sorting out what you're actually going to perceive and not perceive. And that was my PhD, was the neurophysiology of attention, is how does the brain actually do that? What we're doing today with algorithms is looking at the history of what this individual has as a value and determining what they likely want to perceive and what they want to see. So when you've got these multiple mechanisms coming at you, you can say choked with data and starved for information. I don't think that's necessarily the future. I think that there are those today that are building algorithms to elevate to the level of signal what they believe you will say is important. The difficulty with that is creativity begins to die away, because often creativity is when dissonance occurs. When it doesn't come to you because you expect it, and you don't necessarily let it in. It might have happened in a dream, it might have happened because of a mistake, but that serendipity of the error, that all of a sudden you see a relationship that was not common, that's what the scientist looks for, is not that everything's the same, but they look for what's different to try and understand the anomaly.
Right.
So that's an exciting moment. And there are many people that don't like that. There are people that want to get on an assembly line in life, that everything is the same. Yes. They want a degree, that everything is the same, I don't get challenged.
Right.
Well, to me, they are in more doo-doo than the people that I worked with in the field of mental retardation, because they've proclaimed death.
Yes.
They don't want to learn anymore. They don't want dissonance in their lives. That's where the excitement is.
Yeah.
To me, and in my life, the excitement was the dissonance of taking big jumps in my life that I got scared. And because I think this is what a professional learner is. A professional learner will go into the cave that others are afraid to go into, because it's in there that they will discover something that hasn't been seen before.
No, I think the important dissonance now is a very simple one. On the one hand, it's screen space. And on the other hand, it's the single convergent device. Now we have a situation where you can get everything on one device. Well, what size should it be? Well, you're capable of looking at a huge screen. It's not convenient to take a huge screen around with you. So how are we, and that's where all these frustrating things where something comes on top of one of your devices, you're somewhere else, or you're not Hey, that's what it's about. This dissonance, this conflict between screen space on the one hand, in many corporate offices today, they have 3 large monitors, and you can look at an enormous amount of stuff in that, but it's kind of like nailing your shoes to the floor. What happens when you leave the room? You don't have access to any of that stuff. Now, the stuff that's on those 3 large monitors, can you sometimes somehow have it in an effective way on mobile devices? Well, I think in the future you will be able to. The days of the office with these 3 huge screens will be gone. You'll have that everywhere that you go.
Well, I'll push it even further, because I don't think I'm going to dismiss that as our issue. That'll be the algorithms issue. I'm not sure that that's what I'm not sure that we as human beings can compete in the processing of information, as Watson did on the Jeopardy show. So if that's the case, and we want to enter into that environment, because we'll either bail out, and when we have a problem, some technology will come along to solve it. Mm-hmm. But at some point in time, the offloading of intelligence and machines deciding becomes the real issue.
Yeah.
Are we all going to become artists? Are we going to play in that other part of the hemisphere, which is where music is and where art is and where there's a whole set of new relationships? Will we enter into a period of time where the human being is no longer challenged by problems of muscle, problems of memory, problems of learning? What he's confronted with is problems of boredom. And I'll take you through a little exercise. And I've asked this question of 10,000 people, so I got a pretty idea of what's coming back to me. How many of you are aware of what stem cells have been proclaimed to possibly do, and that is life extension? Right, so we've heard of that, and it's not hard to imagine. So I asked 10,000 people in many different settings, how many of you would opt for everlasting life? Oh boy, you have just screwed up my research.
Well,
okay, but I'm going to take you through the exercise, because I think it illuminates something about who we are as human beings. Most people don't answer yes.
Yeah.
And so I'm stunned when that happens, and I go through a little bit of drama in front of the audience about, I just offered you something that's the most precious gift that anybody's has, which is life. And only 8 of you have ever raised your hand. So I'm confused. Now, maybe you think you're going to look 300 years old.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the issue. So let's imagine that that's not the case, that in fact stem cells or Ponce's promise of everlasting life is not lasting until you're a prune, but you are vibrant and fresh, and life has value. But let me ask you another question, because none of you answered yes, or very few to the first question. How many of you would opt for another day? Everybody raises their hand. Now I got them in a trap. One moment I gave you an infinite amount of something and you turned it down, and now I give you one thing of that something and you want it. Now I'm really confused, because you clearly value it in the supply of one, but not in the value of infinity. So I scratched my head and I asked him another question. If I gave you the option of a certain number of years, how many years would you take? And the general answer is about 100. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because it coincides probably with what today's biological limits are.
Yes.
But what is it about 101 years that is different than 100? And I have to conclude that it's experience and boredom. And that what they're telling me is that life, as they have defined it, is about experiences. And whether those experiences remain interesting, whether those experiences remain different, because they don't want to be repeating the same thing over and over and over again. And I thought that therein lies an understanding of what man is man is experiences. And if those experiences are varied, then life has value. But when life does not have a variability to it, it has no value.
Yes.
Which says that the individual who thirsts to have a standard, common, homeostatic life is proclaiming an early death.
Yeah. So if you consider the possibility of a post-scarcity world where robots do virtually everything that human beings do now.
Sure.
Can we offload all that? Well, on the one hand, why not? A lot of people spend most of the day complaining about their jobs. It's a very common thing to have most of your conversations about that. So why not take everything that you do today and have a machine that can do that? Why not?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
what's left? What else will we do? What will our purpose be?
Yeah.
Many people, if you say, well, who are you? They start telling you their job. Mm-hmm. They identify that's the reason that they exist, because they have this job. This is what they do. What if practically everything that human beings do today, robots do tomorrow? Then when somebody asks us who we are, how will we describe ourselves? Well, I have an aspiration to have, a certain kind of experience?
Well, I mean, Maslow opens up that dialogue. If the individual has no material means, then that becomes their driver. If they don't have friends, they become socially driven. At some point in time, they try to realize and become self-actualized to determine what their limits are.
Yes.
That's the domain of today. I won't even, in this context, without a martini in hand, enter into a dialogue about what I think comes next. Fortunately, well, maybe not so fortunately, if stem cells arrive, I'll be able to witness it and I'll watch it. But I won't even pretend, because the institutional structure that we've been living in and the habits and the values will be so different that I think it's almost impossible to discuss and to truly understand what, quote, the relevance of mankind may be. It may be that mankind becomes irrelevant. It may be that this is simply a passing on. That's one scenario. There's another one where we all become freaking geniuses, not because our brains are so bright, but because the algorithms are doing so many amazing things that I don't want to go there. I think that's time to hope that the classes come to an end and we leave everybody begging to come back next year so we get a little bit closer. But it's only with a martini that I enter into the next realm. My wife would shoot me to be otherwise.
It's fascinating to think that, at the moment it seems like Einstein was seriously wrong about only one thing, and it's so boring, really, what he was wrong about. That is the assumption that every human being wishes to be inspired by the stars in the sky and so on. A number of things that he said suggest that. And yet you can imagine felons robbing houses in dark places in cities and so on, who actually never look at the night sky. I would think that's totally lame. I mean, why are you looking at the stars? So it would be nice if he were right, and maybe human beings will change so we're all capable of being, inspired by beauty and all this sort of thing.
Well, I look into physics every now and then. I'm always, when I alluded to the early stages of one's life when you lie in the meadows and you look at infinity, is to try and understand whether or not the relationship of man to the environment will in any way define where we might end up, whether there is such a thing as string theory, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing that does appear to be apparent at the moments of creation, whether or not you're creationist or you look at the emergence of the universe, is uncertainty.
Yes.
The variable of uncertainty is the determinant, not all the rest. And I think that will prevail. And in light of that, we will remain thirsting to know. And that is where we left the Garden of Eden and created our original sin, where we lost faith and said, I want to know. And we've all entered into that, and that's our sin, as our thirst. And there's always that element of uncertainty to keep us going.
Right.
We've entered into a lot of philosophy there, but by and large, science is based on philosophy and to try and resolve uncertainty. And that's how most of us spend our lives, some of us more intensely and others incidentally. But it's an incredible journey, and hopefully it lasts for a long while.